In January of 1890, a railroad foreman named John Stevens stood on a wooden trestle bridge in the Cascade Mountains of Washington state. The temperature was 38 degrees below zero. The bridge was 300 feet above the canyon floor, and the wind was tearing across the timber at close to 50 miles an hour. His boots were frozen to the deck planking. His men were out on the bracing below, swinging ice axes at the rime that had built up overnight on the trestle's cross members. The ice had to come off before daylight. If it stayed, the added weight could buckle a brace, and if one brace went, the whole span could follow. Stevens had been at Stampede Pass for 2 months. The previous foreman had quit in November after losing 3 days of rail traffic to snow. The Northern Pacific Railway needed someone who would not quit. Stevens did not quit, but he paid for it. 2 of his men fell from the trestle that winter. One slipped on an iced-over stringer at 4 in the morning. The other was blown off a cross brace by a gust that came without warning. Stevens buried them both in the small company cemetery at Stampede Pass, in graves that had to be chipped from frozen ground with pickaxes because the soil was hard as stone down to 4 feet. This is the story of how America built and maintained wooden trestle bridges through the worst winters North America had to offer. The Cascades, the Sierras, the Rockies, the Great Lakes country. Temperatures that dropped to 40 below zero. Snow loads that reached 40 feet in a single season. And the men, most of them unnamed, who kept the trains running through all of it. To understand why anyone would build a wooden bridge 300 feet above a frozen canyon and then try to keep it standing through a mountain winter, you need to understand the problem that railroad companies faced after 1860. The Transcontinental Railroad was not a summer project. Congress, the shipping companies, the mail system, the military, every interest that mattered demanded year-round service. You could not shut down for 5 months because there was snow in the mountains. The economy would not allow it, the contracts would not allow it, and the competing railroads would eat you alive if you tried. But the mountains did not care about contracts. The Sierra Nevada could drop 44 feet of snow in a single winter. The Cascades averaged 25 to 30 feet at the higher passes. The Northern Rockies at Marias Pass in Montana regularly hit 30 to 40 degrees below zero for weeks at a stretch, with winds that turned any exposed skin white in minutes. The Great Lakes country, where timber railroads hauled logs to the mills all winter, had its own particular misery. Less snow than the Sierras, but brutal cold. 40 below with a wind off Lake Superior that could freeze a man's lungs if he breathed too deep. The wooden trestle bridge was the cheapest and fastest way to cross a mountain canyon. You felled local timber, you cut it to dimension with a portable sawmill, you raised bents, the vertical frames that hold the deck, you braced them, and you laid rail on top. A crew of 40 men could put up a 200-foot trestle in 3 to 4 weeks during the building season. Compared to filling a canyon with rock or cutting a tunnel through a mountain, the trestle was fast, practical, and affordable. The Central Pacific used them by the dozen across the Sierra. The Northern Pacific used them through the Cascades. The Great Northern used them through the Rockies at Marias Pass. Every mountain railroad in America relied on wooden trestles to get over the terrain that stood between the capital and the commerce. But the trestle had one problem that no one fully appreciated until the first winter came. Snow on the deck could derail a locomotive. Ice on the bracing added thousands of pounds of dead weight to a structure designed to carry only its own timber and the weight of a train. Wind loaded the structure sideways, a force the original engineers had not always accounted for. And fire, from the red-hot embers that fell from locomotive fireboxes and stove chimneys, could reduce a trestle to ash in 30 minutes. The first winter on any new mountain railroad line killed more workers than the construction had. That was the pattern. You built the bridge in summer, you celebrated when the first train crossed it, and then winter came, and you learned what you had actually built. If you are watching stories like this one for the first time, consider subscribing. This channel covers the men and the methods behind the infrastructure that built this country, and there is much more to come. The winter of 1867 nearly destroyed the Central Pacific Railroad. The Sierra Nevada received 44 feet of snow that season at Donner Pass. 44 feet. That is not a misprint. If you stack that snow from the ground, it would bury a 4-story building with room to spare. The wooden trestles on the Donner route were overwhelmed. Snowdrifts covered the deck, packed hard by wind until they were nearly as dense as ice. Trains could not pass. Rotary plows did not yet exist. The only option was men with shovels. The Central Pacific sent Chinese laborers out in teams of 40 to 60 to shovel the trestles clear. They worked in shifts, 12 hours on, 12 hours off, in conditions that would be considered criminal by any modern standard. Some of them tunneled through snowdrifts that were taller than the trestle itself, carving passages just wide enough for a locomotive to squeeze through. The snow walls on either side rose 20 feet above the smokestacks. When a train passed through one of these hand-cut tunnels, the engineer could reach out and touch packed snow on both sides of the cab. The sound was eerie. The exhaust of the locomotive echoed off the snow walls, muffled and distorted, as if the mountain itself were breathing. The winter of 1888, known in the East as the Great Blizzard, killed over 400 people across the Northeast and shut down railroads from Virginia to Maine. But in the mountains of the West, 1888 was just another winter. The Cascades got their usual 30 feet. The Sierras got their usual 35. The section crews shoveled and climbed and froze, as they did every year. The difference was that now the eastern newspapers noticed, because their own cities had been paralyzed by a storm that mountain railroaders would have called a routine Tuesday. The winter of 1893 brought the collapse near Stevens Pass and forced a reckoning with how the railroads calculated ice load on bracing. But that story comes later. What all of these winters taught the railroad companies was the same hard lesson. You could not fight the mountain with muscle alone. You needed structure. You needed engineering. You needed the snowshed. A snowshed was exactly what it sounds like. A wooden tunnel built over the railroad track, and in many cases directly over the trestle bridge itself, designed to keep snow from ever reaching the deck. The concept was simple. The engineering was not. The Donner Pass snowsheds, built by the Central Pacific Railroad between 1868 and 1879, stretched 37 miles in total length. 37 miles of continuous timber roofing and walls, bolted and braced together, running through the Sierra Nevada like a wooden intestine threaded along the mountainside. At the time of completion, it was the largest wooden structure in North America. Some historians argue it was the largest wooden structure in the world. The sheds were built from local timber, sugar pine, Douglas fir, whatever was close enough to drag to the construction site by mule or ox team. The roof beams were designed to bear 10 feet of snow. 10 feet of packed, wind-compacted snow, weighing roughly 62 pounds per cubic foot. That is an enormous load. The engineers calculated that the roof of a standard 40-foot wide snowshed section, carrying 10 feet of packed snow, supported roughly 124,000 pounds per section. Multiply that by 37 miles, and you begin to understand the scale of what was built. This was not carpentry. This was structural engineering, executed in timber at industrial scale, in the mountains, by hand. To carry that load, the builders used massive timbers. Roof beams 12 inches by 16 inches. Posts 14 inches square. The walls were double layered, with 6-inch planking on the outside and 4-inch planking on the inside, with a gap between to allow for drainage and prevent the inner wall from rotting against the snowpack. Ventilation slots cut into the walls kept the interior from becoming a suffocation hazard when locomotives passed through, belching smoke and cinders. Even with ventilation, the air inside a snowshed when a train passed was thick enough to choke on. Engineers reported that visibility dropped to less than 5 feet. They ran by feel, counting the timber posts flashing past the cab window, knowing from memory exactly how many posts separated one curve from the next. But the snowsheds introduced a new problem that the engineers had not anticipated: fire. A locomotive climbing a mountain grade ran its firebox at maximum output. Embers flew from the smokestack in a stream of orange sparks. Hot coals dropped from the ash pan onto the ties below. Inside a wooden snowshed, those embers landed on dry timber. The sheds burned regularly. The Central Pacific employed fire patrols, men who walked the length of the sheds day and night with water buckets, watching for smoke. In the 1870s and 80s, at least 7 major snowshed fires were recorded on the Donner Pass line alone. Each time, the shed had to be rebuilt, often in the middle of winter, with crews working in the snow to raise new timbers over the same track. They would clear the debris, cut fresh beams from nearby timber, and frame up a new section while the wind drove snow horizontally through the gap. The irony is hard to miss. They built the sheds to protect the track from snow, but the sheds themselves were at constant risk from the very locomotives they were built to shelter. Therefore, the snowshed was never a solution. It was a trade. You traded the problem of snow for the problem of fire, and you hired more men to manage both. Now the snowsheds covered the track, but someone still had to maintain the structures themselves, inspect the trestles beneath them, and clear every exposed stretch of deck before each train. In the mountain passes of the American West, that work fell to the section crews. A section crew on a mountain railroad in winter was typically 12 to 20 men, assigned to a stretch of track between 5 and 15 miles long. Their job was to keep the line open. That meant shoveling snow off the deck of any exposed trestle before each train. It meant climbing the trestle structure itself to break ice off the bracing. It meant inspecting every bent, every stringer, every bolt for damage after storms. It meant replacing broken timbers, tightening bolts that had loosened from freeze-thaw cycles, and clearing debris from the track after windstorms brought down trees. And it meant doing all of this in darkness, in sub-zero temperatures, with hand tools. The daily routine at Stampede Pass in the winter of 1890 under John Stevens went like this. The crew woke at 3:30 in the morning. They ate a meal of salt pork, beans, and black coffee in a bunkhouse that was heated by a single cast-iron stove. The stove glowed red by morning, but the corners of the bunkhouse were still cold enough to freeze the water in a wash basin overnight. By 4 o'clock, they were on the trestle. The first train was due at 6:30. They had 2.5 hours to clear 6 feet of snow off the deck, which was typically 300 to 400 feet long and 18 feet wide. 6 feet of snow on a surface of roughly 7,000 square feet is approximately 42,000 cubic feet of snow. That is not a number that means much until you start shoveling it. Each man was expected to move between 150 and 200 cubic feet per hour. They worked by kerosene lantern light. The wind at Stampede Pass averaged 20 to 30 miles per hour in winter, with gusts reaching 50. The lanterns blew out regularly. The men shoveled in the dark, feeling for the edge of the deck with their boots. If a man stepped off the edge, he fell 300 feet. It happened more than once. There were no guardrails. There was nothing resembling a safety harness. There was no net, no rope, no system of any kind to prevent a man from stepping into empty air. You shoveled, and you felt for the edge, and you paid attention. If you lost focus for 1 second in the wind and the dark, you were gone. The sound of a shovel hitting snow was the rhythm of the work. The sound stopped when someone went over the edge. After the deck was clear, the crew descended to the bracing. This was worse. The cross braces on a trestle were typically 8x8 timbers, sometimes 6x8, spaced at intervals along the bents. They were coated in ice, which added weight and could cause the braces to slip in their joints. The men climbed down using ladders lashed to the bents with rope, carrying ice axes and kerosene torches. The torches were used to melt ice that was too thick to chip. You would hold a burning torch against the ice on a brace, wait for it to soften, then strike with the axe. The meltwater ran down the timber and often refroze before it reached the ground. The men's gloves were soaked within minutes. Wet leather in 30 below air freezes stiff as wood. So they worked with bare hands, because frozen gloves were worse than no gloves at all. You could feel the timber with bare fingers. You could not feel anything through a glove that had turned to a frozen shell. Some of these men had been railroad construction workers in summer. Some were immigrants, Scandinavians who knew cold from the old country. Chinese laborers who had survived the Sierra winters of the 1860s and 70s and stayed on because the railroad was the only employer who would hire them. Irish gangers who had built the grade and stayed on for winter work because there was nowhere else to go and no money to go there with. Many of them have no record at all. Their names do not appear in company ledgers. They appear only in cemetery headstones at remote mountain passes, or they do not appear at all. Now consider the deaths, not as a spectacle, but as a cost. The cost of keeping a railroad running through a mountain winter. Frostbite was the everyday injury. Fingers, toes, ears, noses. The company surgeons at the mountain stations treated frostbite so frequently that they developed their own shorthand for the severity. First degree was numbness and white skin, which would recover. Second degree was blisters, which might heal. Third degree was blackened tissue that had to be cut away with a knife. A man who lost 3 fingers to frostbite was given his pay and sent down the mountain. There was no compensation beyond that. No pension, no disability payment. He walked down to the valley and found work he could do with 7 fingers, or he did not. Falls from trestles were the second most common cause of death. The records from the Northern Pacific Railway for the Stampede Pass section between 1888 and 1895 list 11 workers killed by falls. 11 men, in 7 years, on one section of track. That is roughly 1 man every 7.5 months, falling 300 feet onto frozen rock. The bodies were recovered when weather permitted. Sometimes that took days. Sometimes the body lay at the base of the canyon until the snow melted enough to reach it. Avalanches took whole crews at once. A crew shoveling an exposed trestle below a steep slope was always at risk. The snow above them could release without warning, triggered by wind, temperature change, or nothing at all. One moment they were shoveling. The next, they were buried under 10 or 20 feet of slide debris, packed snow mixed with broken trees and rock, moving at 60 miles an hour. Recovery of bodies from avalanche debris was slow, brutal work. Men dug with shovels and bare hands. Sometimes the bodies were not found until spring, when the snow finally melted and revealed what the mountain had taken. But the greatest single disaster on any mountain trestle line was the Wellington avalanche of 1910, and it deserves its own telling. Wellington was a small railroad town on the Great Northern Railway line in the Cascade Mountains of Washington State. It sat at the western portal of the Cascade Tunnel, near Stevens Pass, the same pass that John Stevens had surveyed years earlier. In late February of 1910, a series of storms buried the Cascades under feet of snow. 2 trains, a passenger express and a mail train, became stranded at Wellington, unable to move forward through the snow-blocked track, and unable to back up because the track behind them had also been buried. For 6 days, the train sat on a narrow ledge cut into the mountainside, just below a steep slope of old-growth timber and loose rock. The passengers grew restless. Some demanded to walk out. Railroad workers attempted to clear the track ahead with rotary plows, but the snow was falling faster than they could remove it. The superintendent made the decision to hold the trains in place, believing the storm would break. It did not. On the night of March 1st, the weather shifted. Rain began to fall on top of the heavy snowpack, softening it, adding weight. Lightning flashed over the mountains, unusual for that time of year and that altitude. At 1:18 in the morning, an avalanche broke loose from the ridge above Wellington. It swept down the mountainside, carrying trees, boulders, and an estimated volume of snow that covered 10 acres to a depth of 40 feet. The avalanche struck both trains and hurled them 150 feet down the mountainside into the Ty River Canyon. 96 people were killed. 23 survived, many with severe injuries. It remains the deadliest avalanche in American history. I have stood at the Wellington Memorial. The site is quiet now. The old railroad grade is a hiking trail called the Iron Goat Trail. The tunnel portals are still there, bricked up and marked with small interpretive signs. There is a modest stone marker listing the dead. When you stand there in summer, with the Douglas fir trees swaying overhead and the sound of the Ty River below, it is nearly impossible to imagine what that place looked like on March 1st, 1910. The wreckage of 2 trains scattered down a mountainside in the dark. The screaming of survivors trapped under debris. The lanterns swinging in the rain as railroad workers dug with their hands through snow and splintered wood, pulling out bodies through the long night. If you have been watching this far, you understand why this history matters. Consider subscribing so these stories reach more people who care about the men who built this country. The Wellington disaster forced a reckoning. James Hill, the president of the Great Northern Railway, the man who had ordered the Marias Pass crossing built through some of the coldest terrain on the continent, the man who had pushed his railroad through the Cascades at Stevens Pass, had to answer for Wellington. Congress investigated. Newspapers demanded accountability. The public demanded changes. The Great Northern eventually replaced the original Cascade Tunnel with a new, longer tunnel that bypassed the Wellington site entirely. It took years and millions of dollars. The town of Wellington was renamed Ty because the old name carried too much grief for anyone to use. But the trestle bridges on other lines remained, and the men who maintained them kept working through every winter that followed. One of the tools that kept those lines open was not a shovel or an ice axe. It was a locomotive. The wedge plow was the simplest snow-clearing device on a mountain railroad. A heavy steel or iron wedge bolted to the front of a locomotive, designed to push snow off the track at speed. It worked on light snow, the kind that fell at lower elevations or during the early weeks of winter. A locomotive running at 15 to 20 miles an hour with a wedge plow could clear a foot or two of fresh snow without stopping. The snow sprayed to both sides of the track like water off the bow of a ship. But wedge plows were useless against packed snow, drifts, and the deep accumulations that built up in mountain passes over weeks of continuous storms. For that, the railroads needed something more. In 1869, a man named John Elliott patented the rotary snowplow. The concept was elegant. A large, circular blade, sometimes 10 to 12 feet in diameter, mounted on the front of a dedicated snowplow car. The blades spun at high speed, cutting into packed snow and ice, and throwing the debris to the side of the track through a directional chute. The rotary plow was powered by its own steam engine, separate from the locomotive pushing it from behind. The rotary plow changed mountain railroading. Before Elliott's invention, the only way to clear deep snow was by hand, or by ramming a wedge plow into a drift and hoping the locomotive did not derail. The rotary plow could cut through drifts 12 to 15 feet deep at a walking pace. It was loud. The noise of the spinning blade hitting packed snow was described by one foreman as the sound of a sawmill chewing through green wood, a grinding, ripping shriek that echoed off the canyon walls and could be heard a mile away. You would hear it coming long before you saw it, and you knew to get clear. The rotary plows were themselves maintained by their own crews, men who rode the plow car and shoveled the chute clear when it clogged, which happened constantly. Wet snow was the worst. It packed into the chute and froze solid, and the only way to clear it was to stop the blade and chip the ice out by hand, while standing directly in front of a machine designed to hurl snow at 60 miles an hour. When the blade restarted, you had better be clear of the chute. Therefore, the winter maintenance of a mountain railroad was not a single operation. It was a system of interlocking efforts: wedge plows for light snow, rotary plows for deep drifts, section crews for the trestles, fire patrols for the snowsheds. And behind all of it, the telegraph, clicking out messages from one section station to the next, reporting conditions, calling for reinforcements, announcing the injured and the dead. The telegraph operators at the mountain stations were essential. They lived in tiny wooden shacks beside the track, often alone, and they stayed awake through the night, listening for the clicking of the key. A message from the section crew 2 miles up the line might say the track was clear. Or it might say a man was down and they needed a stretcher. Or it might say the trestle was groaning under ice load and no train should cross until morning. Those operators held lives in their hands. A missed message, a delayed relay, a garbled word could mean a train sent onto a bridge that was not safe. The telegraph wire itself was vulnerable. Ice storms brought the wire down. Falling trees snapped the poles. When the telegraph went silent in a mountain blizzard, the section crews were on their own, making decisions about bridge safety with nothing but their own eyes and ears and judgment. But the bridges themselves sometimes failed. And when they failed in winter, the consequences were immediate and total. The trestle near Stevens Pass that collapsed in the winter of 1893 went down under a combination of ice load and wind. The bracing on the eastern side of the span had accumulated so much ice over a period of weeks that the weight exceeded the design capacity of the joints. A sustained west wind applied lateral force to the ice-loaded structure. The eastern braces buckled first. The deck tilted, slowly at first, then faster. And then the whole span, roughly 150 feet of timber, folded sideways and dropped into the canyon. The sound, according to a section crew working a quarter-mile down the line, was like a building falling. A long, splintering roar, followed by silence, and then the echo coming back off the canyon walls. No train was on the bridge when it went. That was luck, not planning. The collapse happened between trains at roughly 2 in the afternoon. The section crew had inspected the bridge that morning and noted heavy ice on the bracing, but had not flagged it as critical. After the collapse, the Northern Pacific revised its inspection protocols and began requiring section crews to measure ice thickness on braces daily and report any accumulation over 4 inches to the division superintendent by telegraph. Fire was the other destroyer of wooden trestles in winter. Locomotive fireboxes ran at over 1,000 degrees. Embers fell onto wooden deck planking that had been dried by months of cold, low-humidity mountain air. Hot ash from the firebox dropped through grates onto the ties below. And the wind funneled through the canyon, feeding any spark that caught. A single ember could smolder in a joint for hours before flaming. By the time the fire was visible, the damage was done. The bracing would burn through, the deck would sag, and the section crew would arrive to find a bridge that was no longer safe to cross. You could smell a trestle fire before you could see it. The scent of burning creosote and old-growth fir carried on the mountain wind, sharp and unmistakable. When a section foreman caught that smell, he stopped the next train by telegraph and sent men ahead on foot to find the source. Every wooden trestle in the mountains existed in a cycle: built in summer, tested by winter, damaged or destroyed by ice, wind, and fire, repaired or replaced the following summer, and tested again. The mountain never got tired. The mountain never quit. The mountain had all the time in the world. But some of the bridges held. The Stampede Pass trestle, the one John Stevens fought to keep open in the winter of 1890, stood for over 2 decades. It was eventually replaced by a steel structure in 1912, but the original timber bents had survived 22 winters of 40 below temperatures, 40-foot snow loads, and constant icing. When the replacement crew pulled the old timbers out, they found that the heartwood of the Douglas fir posts was still sound. The outer inches had weathered and cracked, but the core was solid. Dense, resinous, stubborn wood that had refused to rot for more than 2 decades in the wettest, coldest, most punishing environment on the continent. The Marias Pass crossing in Montana, built under orders from James Hill, carried Great Northern trains over the Continental Divide at an elevation of 5,213 feet. The original wooden trestles on the approach grades were some of the most exposed structures in the entire railroad system. Temperatures at Marias Pass dropped to 40 below zero or colder on a regular basis. The wind was relentless, pouring through the gap in the Rockies like water through a funnel. Hill is reported to have said that he would build his railroad over Marias Pass or not at all. He built it. The wooden trestles lasted until they were filled in with rock or replaced with steel, but the right-of-way is still in service today. If you cross Marias Pass on a westbound Amtrak train, you are riding over the same route that James Hill's engineers surveyed in the winter of 1889. The same curves, the same grades. The geometry of the line has not changed in more than 130 years. The Donner Pass snowsheds, the 37 miles of wooden tunnel that protected the Central Pacific Line through the Sierra Nevada, were gradually replaced with concrete snowsheds and open cuts through the 20th century. But some of the original wooden posts are still standing in the Sierra forest. They are gray and weathered, 6 and 7 feet tall, sticking up out of the forest floor like old teeth. You can find them if you hike the old railroad grade above Donner Lake in summer. They are not marked. There is no interpretive sign. There is no plaque or fence or trail guide pointing them out. They are just there, silent. The bones of a structure that once held up the entire Western railroad system through the worst winters the Sierra could produce. I have walked that grade. I have put my hand on one of those posts. The wood is hard as iron, dense and dry, the grain tight from 150 years of Sierra weather. It does not feel like a relic. It feels like a thing that was built to last, and did. The men who built those posts and cut those beams and raised those sheds are mostly anonymous. The Chinese laborers who shoveled the Donner Pass trestles in the winter of 1867 left almost no written record. Their names were not recorded by the Central Pacific. They appear in payroll records as group numbers, not individuals. Entire crews of 40 men reduced to a single line in a ledger book. The Scandinavian section crews at Stampede Pass appear in company records as last names and daily rates. $1.50 a day for winter work. $1.75 if you were willing to climb the bracing. The Irish gangers who maintained the Marias Pass approaches are remembered in a few photographs, groups of men in heavy coats standing on snow-covered decks, holding long-handled shovels, squinting into the wind. Their faces are blurred by long exposure times and fading emulsions, already half gone. John Stevens is remembered. He went on to survey Stevens Pass itself, the crossing that bears his name in the Cascades. He became one of the most respected railroad engineers in the Northwest, a man who was known for going where others would not and staying when others left. But the men who fell from his trestle at Stampede Pass in the winter of 1890 are not remembered. Their graves at the company cemetery have no legible markers. The wood has rotted. The paint has flaked away. The names are gone. James Hill is remembered. He built an empire. He put the Great Northern Railway across the northern tier of the United States, from St. Paul to Seattle, without a single dollar of government subsidy. He is in the history books, in the business schools, in the names of streets and buildings across the upper Midwest. But the men who froze at Marias Pass, who shoveled his trestles clear at 3 a.m. in 40 below air, who lost fingers and toes, and sometimes their lives, keeping his railroad profitable, they are footnotes at best. Most are not even that. Most are nothing. Erased by time and by the indifference of the institutions that worked them. John Elliott is remembered, barely. His rotary snowplow saved the mountain railroads. Without it, the winter lines might have been abandoned entirely. His patent changed the industry. But ask anyone on the street who invented the rotary snowplow, and you will get a blank stare. His name appears in railroad engineering histories, and almost nowhere else. If you have made it to this point in the story, you are the kind of person who cares about what came before. Subscribe to this channel, because there are hundreds more stories like this one, and they deserve to be told properly. The trains still run through the mountains. The Cascade Line still carries freight through the same passes where John Stevens buried his dead. The Donner Pass route still operates, though the trains now run through tunnels and concrete sheds instead of those old wooden structures. Marias Pass still carries Amtrak's Empire Builder, named for James Hill himself, across the Continental Divide on a grade that Hill's engineers laid out more than 130 years ago. The wooden trestles are gone, almost all of them, replaced by steel, by concrete, by earthen fills that took years and thousands of loads of rock to build. The snowsheds are gone, replaced by avalanche fences and concrete galleries, and, in some places, nothing at all, because modern locomotives are heavy enough and strong enough to push through snow that would have buried a 19th century engine. But the rights of way remain. The routes that those men surveyed and built and maintained through impossible conditions are still the routes the trains follow today. The grades they cut are still the grades. The curves they laid are still the curves. The American railroad map in the Mountain West is, in its essential geometry, the map that those builders drew with timber and iron and human lives between 1865 and 1910. What has been lost is the knowledge of what it cost. Not in dollars, in skin and bone. In mornings at 4 o'clock on a frozen trestle 300 feet above a canyon floor, swinging an ice axe in the dark, while the wind blows out your lantern, and the edge of the deck is somewhere behind you, but you cannot see it. In the weight of a shovelful of snow, when your hands have gone numb and your gloves have frozen stiff, and you know the train is coming in 2 hours, whether the deck is clear or not. I think about John Stevens sometimes, standing on that trestle at Stampede Pass in January of 1890. 38 below zero. 2 of his men dead. The line still had to open by 6:30. He did not have the luxury of reflection. He did not have the luxury of grief. He had a job to do, and the train was coming, and the snow was not going to shovel itself. He kept the line open. That is what the records say. He kept the line open all winter. Every winter he was there. The trains ran, the mail moved, the cargo arrived. And the cost of that achievement was carried by men whose names we have lost, in graves we can no longer find, on a mountain that does not remember them. The timber remembers. Those old snowshed posts in the Sierra forest, gray and hard and still standing after more than a century. They are the last physical evidence that any of this happened at all. Go find one. Put your hand on it. Feel how solid it is, how dense, how stubborn. That is the legacy. Not the railroad, not the profits, not the empire. The wood. The thing that was cut and shaped and raised by hand, and left to stand against the mountain for as long as it could. It is still standing.